Hey guys, welcome to our channel. Before starting the video, if you have not subscribed our channel till now, then please subscribe it. And if you have not watched our previous videos, then watch it. In this video, we will see types of scope provided by Spring. In the Spring Bean configurations, Bean attribute called scope defines what kind of object has to be created and returned. Here is the syntax. When you create a bean definition, what you are actually creating is an actual instance of the class defined by the bean definition. So you can control object creation using scope attribute. This approach is very powerful and gives you the flexibility to choose the scope of the objects you create through configuration instead of having to the scope of an object at the Java class level. Spring Framework supports 5 scopes. Singleton. Scope is single bean definition to a single object instance per Spring IOC container. Prototype scope is single bean definition to any number of object instances. The request scopes a single bean definition to the life cycle of a single HTTP request, that is, each and every HTTP request will have its own instance of a bean created off the back of a single bean definition, only valid in the context of a web-aware Spring application context. The session scopes a single bean definition to the life cycle of an HTTP session, only valid in the context of a web-aware Spring application context. The global session scopes a single bean definition to the life cycle of a global HTTP session, typically only valid when used in a portlet context, only valid in the context of web-aware Spring application context. The Singleton scope. Singleton scope is the default one. Singleton scope should be used for stateless beans. When a bean is a singleton, only one shared an instance of the bean will be managed, and all requests for beans with an id or ids matching that bean definition will result in that one specific bean instance being returned by the Spring container. When you define a bean definition and it is scoped as a singleton, then the Spring IOC container will create exactly one instance of the object defined by that bean definition. This single instance will be stored in a cache of such singleton beans, and all subsequent requests and references for that named bean will result in the cached object being returned. Singleton example. First of all, beans are singleton by default. If you want, then there is an attribute called scope and set value as a singleton. There is one more attribute called singleton and set value true. Let's implement. Let's copy existing project and make it simple, so name it scopes. Let's run and see it's working fine or not. See it's working fine. Along with message, let's put object itself. Now you can see object also printing with hash code. To check singleton, let's copy existing object, and after run let's see what is it printing. See, both objects are showing the same hash code. That means the new object is not creating. Let's change message for greeting to object. Let's run and see what is the output. As you can see, object hash I code is same, and after change message for greeting two objects and for greeting object message also changed. I hope you understood. So this is the default behavior. Now let's add scope attribute for this bean and set the value singleton. See, still everything is same. Now let's add init and destroy flow also and see when those methods are calling. Let's run again. The only init is calling because not modified code completely. Now run again. Scene now destroy is also calling. You are wondering why am I showing all this, because this will help you to remember when I will change the scope from Singleton to prototype. The prototype scope. Prototype scope for all beans that are stateful. Prototype scope of bean deployment results in the creation of a new bean instance every time a request for that specific bean is made. Spring does not manage the complete life cycle of a prototype bean. The container instantiates, configures, decorates and otherwise assembles the prototype object, hands it to the client and then has no further knowledge of that prototype instance. This means that while initialization lifecycle callback methods will be called on all objects regardless of scope, in the case of prototypes, any configured destruction lifecycle callbacks will not be called. It is the responsibility of the client code to clean up prototype scope, objects and release any expansive resources that the prototype beans are holding onto. One possible way to get the Spring container to release resources used by prototype scoped beans is through the use of a custom bean post processor, which would hold a reference to the beans that need to clean up. Prototype example. There is a scope attribute so for that set value as the prototype. For backward compatibility make it Singleton false. Let's implement. Now let's change the scope from Singleton to prototype. Let's run and see what is the output. Now you can see both objects have the different hash code and destroy method also not calling. So it's a responsibility of client code to clean up prototype scope, objects or can create custom bean post processor. Other scopes. The other scopes, namely request, session, and global session, are for use only in web-based applications. If you are using a web-aware Spring application context implementation such as XML web application context, if you try using these next scopes with regular Spring IOC containers such as the XML bean factory or classpath XML application context, you will get an illegal state exception complaining about an unknown bean scope. Other scopes examples. The request Spring container will create a brand new instance of the logic action bean using the login action bean definition for each and every HTTP request. When the request is finished processing, the bean that is scoped to the request will be discarded. The session Spring container will create a brand new instance of the user preferences bean using the user preferences bean definition for the lifetime of single HTTP session. When the HTTP session is eventually discarded, the bean that is scoped to that particular HTTP session will also be discarded. The global session. The global session is similar to the standard HTTP session scope, and really only makes sense in the context of a portlet-based web application. Singleton versus Singleton design pattern. Spring Singleton is described as per container per bean, or Singleton scope in Spring means the single instance in a Spring context. Singleton pattern says that one and only one instance of a particular class will ever be created per class loader. Spring Singleton bean can be any normal class you write, but declaring its scope as Singleton means that Spring will only create one instance and provide its reference to all beans that reference the declared bean. You may have many instances of that class in your application, but only one will be created for that bean. You may even have multiple beans of the same class all declared as Singleton. Each bean will create exactly one instance of the class. A Java Singleton, for the design pattern where instantiation is restricted to one usually per JVM class loader by the code. I hope this video will help you to remember all types of scope provided by Spring. I hope you like this video, then please subscribe our channel.